Nibbana, the Supreme Peace. Introduction. Most people freely acknowledge that life, both on a personal and on a social level, involves facing problems. A close inspection reveals that all of these problems stem from the same source, that is, by its very nature. Human life is endowed with problems, but it has the potential to cause problems. Human beings encounter many trials and tribulations, which affect their happiness and involve moral issues. The situation can be summed up in one word: suffering, dukkha. Saying that the purpose of life is to pursue happiness implies suffering. The very search for happiness reveals an inner deficiency that drives people to seek fulfillment. This suffering has many consequences. The search for happiness gives rise to conflicts of interest and to social problems. What begins as a personal problem is magnified and spreads outward. Yet this description is still rather ambiguous. For the sake of clarity, one needs to get to the heart of the matter. A basic truth of life is that it is characterized by dukkha. The very nature of human life is marked by this universal characteristic of dukkha. Human life is a conditioned phenomenon, sankhara, subject to various causes and conditions. It is impermanent, unstable, fleeting, and devoid of any lasting self or substance. One is unable to sustain life or to shape it purely according to one's desires. One must conform to causes and conditions. This dukkha on a more fundamental level. The dukkha fundamental to life can be summed up by the words aging, jara, and death, marana, by the words decay and dissolution. In the wake of this fundamental dukkha follows dukkha as a human feeling or emotion. For example, suffering, distress, grief, and regret. Due to the fact that life is characterized by a basic form of dukkha, for people to truly solve problems, bring suffering to an end, and experience real happiness, they must firmly abide in the truth. To begin with, they must come to terms with the fundamental characteristic of dukkha by applying wisdom in order to be free from it or to live with it at ease and to not create problems around it. If one is unable to reach this state, one should at least gain insight into this fundamental dukkha and develop a proper mental attitude in regard to it. One acknowledges and faces the truth with understanding. If people lack this stability and are unable to come to terms with the fundamental characteristic of dukkha, they allow it to become a hidden problem lying within. One then tries to bury one's problems and to turn a blind eye to suffering. One ends up deceiving oneself, and the problems festering in the mind intensify and increase. People claim that they desire happiness and are averse to suffering, but they often create problems for themselves precisely through the means they use to achieve happiness. Instead of dispelling suffering and generating happiness, they evade suffering in order to pursue happiness. They do not attend to the underlying roots of suffering. Their problems then develop into more serious mental complexes. Instead of dispelling or reducing suffering, they increase and compound it, both within themselves and outwards in their conflicts with society. For those people who attempt to cover over and conceal their suffering, their pursuit of happiness indicates a sense of lack, distress, anxiety, and unhappiness. They seek things in order to feel fulfilled or to dispel their agitation, yet in this search they come into conflict with others. Moral issues in society thus become intensified. By attending to suffering incorrectly, people vent their frustrations outwards, increasing suffering both for themselves and others. As a consequence, the inherent stress, which is part and parcel of the conditioned nature of life, is neglected rather than addressed. With their singular ingenuity, people concoct a whole host of problems, until the basic predicament of life of inherent stress is virtually forgotten. People may even delude themselves by thinking that happiness results from turning a blind eye to suffering. To make matters worse, that inherent stress, which has been avoided, covertly incites people to search for and indulge in ever more passionate and restless forms of pleasure, depriving them of confidence and contentment. As a result, moral crises in society become more serious, say through the increase of competition and oppression, and suffering is exacerbated. As long as people are unable to come to terms with this fundamental aspect of life, unable to reconcile themselves to the universal characteristic of dukkha, they will not succeed in resolving their problems. They will not escape the oppression of dukkha. No matter how much happiness they find, they will not meet with true constant happiness, which is intrinsically complete and fully satisfying. Human life involves solving problems and seeking release from suffering. But if we do not know the correct way leading to freedom, our attempted solutions to these problems only bring about increased suffering. The greater the effort, the greater the affliction, becoming an ever more complex cycle, a whirlpool of suffering. This state of affairs is samsara vata, the wandering around or round of rebirth, which the Buddha explained in the teaching of dependent origination, paticca samuppada, under the cycle of origination, samudaya vara, and the forward sequence, anuloma paticca samuppada. There it is revealed how human suffering arises according to cause and effect. If people are unable to face the truth and to understand the true nature of dukkha, besides being free of mental complexes which create and compound problems, they will be able to develop wisdom and to free their minds. Even from the fundamental dukkha inherent to life. The stress and pressure inherent in nature is recognized simply for what it is. It then has no power to create suffering in the minds of these individuals. Even before they have reached complete liberation, Those people who are not deceived or obstructed by unhealthy mental complexes created from unresolved suffering are able to experience happiness in a full and satisfactory way. At the same time, they have the opportunity to develop happiness by accessing ever more refined, independent, spacious, replete, and pure forms of happiness, until they eventually realize the happiness that is completely free from suffering. The pathway to happiness is unrestricted and limitless. When the Buddha taught dependent origination, he did not end with the origin of suffering. He also taught the cycle of cessation, paticca samuppada nirodha vara, which is the process of turning back or turning away, vivata, the end of suffering. Human suffering can be remedied, and there are ways to achieve this. The Buddha went on to reveal the supreme state in which humans are able to live noble lives, enjoy genuine happiness, and bring true benefit and meaning to life. They become free without having to rely on external things or to depend on the happiness determined by conditioned phenomena. Conditioned phenomena cannot sustain themselves, let alone sustain our happiness. Happiness dependent on external things offers no true support, since it is continually reliant on these things. Seeking meaning in this insecure form of happiness results in losing freedom and independence. Although one may not fully attain the state of turning away at first, to the extent that one correctly attends to problems, reducing the force of the origination cycle and increasing the force of the cessation cycle, suffering will gradually abate and one's life will be enhanced. One will be able to experience the pleasures of the world with wisdom, not enslaved to them or harmed by their influctuating currents. Worldly pleasures will not be a source of trouble to oneself or others, and this healthy relationship to pleasure will promote well-being within society. The discussion here focuses on the cessation cycle and the end of suffering, which directly opposes the origination cycle with its resultant suffering.